Is it worth the risk to keep on going?
Sure, to win. I mean, that's what we've always done. The money's never been a factor. We raced when we didn't have any.
There are moments in sports history that stop time. Moments where everything before and everything after gets sorted into two different worlds. For NASCAR, that moment came on February 18th, 2001, at the Daytona International Speedway. Not because of a championship lost, not because of a controversial ruling, but because of a crash that lasted less than 3 seconds and stole one of the greatest drivers the sport had ever produced. Dale Earnhardt Sr. was not just a NASCAR driver. He was the sport itself, walking, talking, and driving at 150 miles per hour. 7 championships, 76 career wins, a personality so large it filled grandstands that seated over 100,000 people. His nickname was the Intimidator, and he had earned every syllable of it. He was the kind of racer who made opponents nervous just by appearing in their rearview mirror. He did not simply compete. He dominated. He commanded. He made the sport feel bigger than it was. And then, on the final lap of the Daytona 500, he was gone. What followed in the hours and days after his crash was a mixture of shock, grief, disbelief, and eventually, cold clinical truth. The autopsy report released by the Volusia County Medical Examiner pulled back every curtain. It answered questions that fans were desperate to have answered. And in doing so, it revealed details that were not just medically significant. They were heartbreaking, because they showed just how fine the line was between survival and tragedy, and how the sport Dale Earnhardt had helped build had not done enough to protect him. To understand what the autopsy revealed, you first have to understand what happened on that track. The 2001 Daytona 500 was in its final moments. Michael Waltrip, driving for Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, was leading the race. Right behind him was Dale Earnhardt Jr., Dale's own son, and behind them both, holding off the rest of the field like a linebacker protecting his quarterback, was Dale Sr. himself. He was not racing for the win that day. He was racing to protect one. He had positioned his black number 3 Chevrolet deliberately between the leaders and the chasing pack, using every ounce of his track knowledge to block, slide, and control the flow of traffic behind him. It was a masterclass in experienced racing, a selfless act from a man who had nothing left to prove. Then, entering turn 4 with the checkered flag almost in sight, contact was made. Sterling Marlin's car clipped the rear quarter panel of Earnhardt's car. It was not a violent hit. By NASCAR standards, it was almost routine. But at those speeds, routine contact carries consequences that are anything but ordinary. Earnhardt's car veered slightly, then snapped hard toward the outside wall. Ken Schrader's vehicle came alongside him. The two cars made contact, and Dale's number 3 Chevrolet hit the concrete barrier head-on. The crash did not look catastrophic from the stands or on television. There was no fire, no spectacular spinning wreck, no explosion of shattered bodywork across the asphalt. The car hit the wall, came to a stop, and sat there. Fans who had watched decades of NASCAR racing probably exhaled and assumed Dale would climb out shaken but walking. He did not climb out. Ken Schrader, whose car had been involved in the collision, rushed over to the driver's side of the number 3 car after getting out of his own vehicle. What he saw made him step back almost immediately. His expression, visible to cameras, said everything his words would not. He refused to describe it to reporters afterward, not out of legal caution, but because he said he had looked at a man who was already gone. Medical personnel arrived quickly and transported Earnhardt to Halifax Medical Center. The race had ended. Michael Waltrip had won. Dale Jr. had finished second, but none of that mattered anymore. The world was waiting, and at 5:16 in the afternoon, the confirmation came. Dale Earnhardt Sr. had died from injuries sustained in the crash. The medical examiner's report was thorough, clinical, and in its own way, devastating. The cause of death was listed as a basilar skull fracture. For anyone unfamiliar with that term, it refers to a fracture at the base of the skull, specifically in the region that surrounds and connects to the brainstem. It is among the most catastrophic injuries a human being can sustain, because the brainstem controls every fundamental function that keeps the body alive. When that area is compromised in the way the autopsy described, survival is nearly impossible. The fracture in Earnhardt's case was what medical professionals refer to as a ring fracture. It circled the base of his skull entirely. This type of injury is caused by sudden, violent deceleration, the kind that occurs when a vehicle traveling at high speed collides with an immovable object. The forces involved do not need to be visible to be lethal. When Earnhardt's car hit that wall, his head snapped forward and then violently backward in a fraction of a second. That motion, that whipping action, was enough to fracture the base of his skull and shut down all brain function instantly. In plain terms, Dale Earnhardt did not suffer. He was gone before he could have registered what was happening. The medical examiner confirmed that death was essentially instantaneous. There was no period of consciousness, no final moments of awareness, just speed then silence. But the skull fracture was not the only finding. The autopsy also documented blunt force trauma to the chest, several fractured ribs, a broken left ankle, and bruising and abrasions consistent with the seatbelt harness cutting into the body during impact. These additional injuries painted a picture of the enormous physical forces that passed through his body in those few seconds of impact. Every bone that broke, every bruise that formed, was a measurement of the violence hidden inside what looked like a moderate crash. Among the most painful and enduring questions that followed the autopsy was the condition of Earnhardt's seatbelt. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, photographs and witness accounts created conflicting narratives. Some images appeared to show a tear in the belt. Some team personnel from Richard Childress Racing claimed the lap belt had sheared during the impact. Others, including rescue worker Tommy Probst, who was among the first to reach Dale in the wreckage, stated firmly that the seatbelt was intact when he arrived at the scene. NASCAR launched a formal investigation into the belt's condition. Engineers examined manufacturing records, reviewed similar crash scenarios, and interviewed everyone who had been in proximity to the car after it came to rest. The investigation could not produce a definitive and universally accepted conclusion, which only deepened the mystery and the grief. What the investigation did confirm, however, was that even a fully functioning seatbelt would not have prevented the fatal injury Dale Earnhardt suffered. The skull fracture was not caused by the seatbelt failing. It was caused by the violent motion of the head during impact. The restraint holding the body in place does not stop the head from whipping independently at extreme speeds. That is the role of an entirely different piece of equipment, one that Dale Earnhardt was not wearing when he died. The head and neck support device, commonly known as the Hans device, had existed in motorsport since the 1980s. It works by anchoring the helmet to the shoulders via a yoke worn across the chest and back, preventing the head from snapping forward independently during sudden deceleration. In crashes exactly like the one that killed Dale Earnhardt, it prevents the kind of violent head motion that causes basilar skull fractures. At the time of his death, the Hans device was not mandatory in NASCAR, and Dale Earnhardt was one of the drivers who had chosen not to wear it. His reasoning, shared by a number of other drivers in the paddock at the time, was that the device restricted his ability to turn his head freely, limiting visibility and mobility inside the cockpit. He valued his freedom of movement. He trusted his experience and his instincts. He had survived dozens of serious crashes without it. That logic made sense to a lot of people in the sport at the time. Racing culture had always leaned toward bravery over caution. Admitting that a safety device was necessary carried a subtle suggestion that the driver needed protection, and in a world built on fearlessness, that was not a comfortable admission. The autopsy report made that logic impossible to maintain. Medical analysis of the crash forces, combined with the specific nature of the ring fracture, led investigators to a conclusion that was included in the subsequent Earnhardt report, a 300-page document commissioned by NASCAR in the aftermath. The conclusion was stark. Had Dale Earnhardt been wearing a Hans device, the forces that fractured the base of his skull would most likely have been prevented or reduced below a lethal threshold. The crash itself was survivable. The lack of a head restraint device made it fatal. That finding changed NASCAR overnight. Within a short period after the autopsy findings and the Earnhardt report were released, drivers who had resisted the device began wearing it. Within a year, NASCAR made it mandatory. The device that Dale Earnhardt had refused to wear became a compulsory piece of equipment for every driver on every track, largely because of what the medical examiner's report revealed about his death. Beyond the Hans device, the autopsy and subsequent investigation cracked open every corner of NASCAR's approach to driver safety. What investigators found was an uncomfortable picture. The cars had evolved over the decades to become faster, stiffer, and more aerodynamically refined. But that same rigidity made them more dangerous in crashes. When the car stopped, the driver absorbed forces that the vehicle itself was no longer designed to dissipate. The cockpit had become a transmission point for energy, rather than a shield against it. The concrete walls that lined tracks like Daytona compounded the problem. They were designed to keep cars on the track, not to absorb impact. When a vehicle hit them at speed, and at the angles common in racing incidents, all of that kinetic energy was reflected directly back into the cockpit and the driver inside it. There was nowhere for the force to go except through the body. NASCAR responded with a wave of reforms that reshaped the physical environment of the sport. The safer barrier, standing for steel and foam energy reduction, was developed and installed across all major venues. These layered barriers replaced bare concrete with materials designed to compress and disperse energy rather than reflect it back. Engineers estimated these barriers could reduce crash impact forces by up to 70% compared to concrete walls alone. The cars were redesigned from the inside out. Cockpit padding was upgraded. Seat mounting angles were studied and revised. Crash data recorders were installed to give engineers better information after incidents. Roll cages were reinforced. The car of tomorrow, introduced in 2007, incorporated all of these lessons into a single comprehensive redesign that prioritized driver survival alongside performance. None of this brought Dale Earnhardt back, but it built a foundation that has kept every NASCAR Cup Series driver alive in the years since. Crashes that would have been fatal in the era before 2001 have become survivable. Ryan Newman's 2020 Daytona wreck, where his car flipped, hit the wall, burst into flames, and slid across the finish line on its roof, is perhaps the most striking example. He walked away, because every system around him had been reimagined in the wake of the autopsy report that revealed the truth about Dale Earnhardt's death. Medical reports are written in the language of facts. Fracture locations, force measurements, tissue damage, toxicology results. They are designed to be precise and unemotional. But the details inside the Volusia County Medical Examiner's report on Dale Earnhardt Sr. carried a weight that statistics alone cannot fully carry. Here was a man who had driven through fire, survived flips, broken bones in crashes that would have retired other drivers, and kept coming back to the track with that same unshakable presence. He had won more championships than almost anyone in the sport's history. He had raced at Daytona more times than most drivers could count. He knew that track. He had mastered it. And in his final race, he was not even racing for himself. He was protecting his son and his driver. He was playing the role of guardian. The crash that took his life was not the result of recklessness or error. It was a combination of unfortunate contact, high speed, and the absence of a single piece of equipment that could have changed the outcome entirely. That is the detail that lingers longest. Not the medical terminology, not the force measurements, but the knowledge that the technology existed to save him, that it was available, and that it was not used. That is what the autopsy report truly revealed. Not just how Dale Earnhardt died, but how close survival had been, and how far the sport had failed to reach it in time. His death did not disappear into history. It became the foundation of every safety advancement that followed. Every driver who has climbed out of a destroyed car since 2001 carries a debt to the medical report that changed everything. Dale Earnhardt did not get to walk away from Turn 4, but because of what his passing revealed, thousands of others have. That is the legacy buried inside those clinical pages. And it is one of the saddest and most powerful stories that motorsport has ever had to tell.